said about jokes, I don't tell jokes. But I will tell you one this morning. Got on the bus the other day, and I spoke to this one. I said to her, what's your name? She says, well, everyone calls me Vivaldi. Oh, I said, is that because you're good on the violin? Is it because you're good with music? She says, no. It's because my name's Viv and I work at Aldi. Without any further ado, we're going to go down now to the Strong Point Centre for the latest news bulletin.
Good morning from the Strong Point Kids newsroom with the latest news affecting our region.
Preachers have been seen in Gateshead and Newcastle warning everyone that God will be serving out his justice in the whole community.
We'd like to jump to Chowding Church for the latest.
Were they good? Give them a round of applause. I think it's important, that we as a church should get the kids involved in various things like that, because that will inspire them. And I'd like you, after the end of the service, please go and see them and tell them what a good job they've done, because that will move them on in their life here at church. But we're looking at Amos this morning. What is the book of Amos about? Some people might think, well, it's about a farmer delivering a message of God's judgment. It's about a prophet foretelling of an attack by an enemy nation. It's about a call to repentance, and it's a message of hope. Amos was called to go out of his comfort zones to the rebels in the north, because that's what they were in God's eyes. To give them a message from God. So this morning, as we look at Amos's message, I think we'll see that this is a message that applies to our country, and it applies to you and me in an amazing way. And it's a message that each of us needs to take to heart. Amos would have been called, I think, in his time, he would have been called the prophet of doom. The prophet of doom. Have you ever met people like that? Prophets of doom. Always looking on the bad side of life, the gloomy side of life. And I think Amos was probably felt as though he would come across as that kind of person. Amos was a simple man, a bit like myself. The teacher used to often say to me, Allport, you're simple. And I thought that was a positive thing, but apparently it wasn't. He was a farmer. Amos was a farmer who herded sheep and harvested fig-like fruit from sycamore trees that grew on his land. He lived and worked on the Tikkun farmland area, southeast of Jerusalem. And by anybody's means, looking at Amos, he was not a professional prophet. He's not the son of a prophet. He's just an ordinary man working in the fields. He's just a farmer. But he was God's man, who God called with God's message. And you know what? That's how God often works in our lives. He chooses ordinary people, often who find themselves in common jobs, and he chooses those ordinary people to do extraordinary things in this kingdom and for his glory. Amos was a bit like that. So I need to tell you this morning, God can do something with your life if you'll place your life in his hands. If you listen to his voice, if you hear his call, and if you're obedient. Amos was all of those things. But from time to time, Amos would come down from the solitude of his wilderness to sell his figs and wool in the markets, and every time he did, he became even more disgusted with the immoral lifestyle of his people. You ever felt like that with people that you meet in life? You feel disgusted by what they're into, where they're heading for, what they're doing with their lives. Amos was a bit like that. And every time he went down, he became even more disgusted with the immoral lifestyle of his people. He knew lots of people, but he didn't like what they were doing. Because Amos saw a culture that's in our society today in which wealth abounded and people gave themselves over to a life of luxury and self-indulgence. Families in the time of Amos had multiple homes, a place to live in the winter and a place to live in the summer. Amos noted that these times that they lived in, there were people who were lavishly furnished in their comforts of their own homes, and that the owners hosted numerous banquets and feasts in their homes. All this ease and extravagance contrasted with the lives of other people who were living in misery and suffering. The poor people who couldn't afford even the bare necessities of life. That's what it was like for Amos to see what was going on. And he wanted to do something about it. How many times do we feel as though, I want to do something about this because there's an injustice there. I want to do something about it, but you choose to sit back. Well, Amos wasn't like that. He wanted to do something about it because God had instructed him to do a work for him. Because Amos saw that there were plenty of palaces in Palestine, but he also saw that there were plenty of shanties. People living out of the equivalent, if you like, in their day, living out of a cardboard box. We know that in society today, don't we? There are people who are living out of cardboard boxes. And it was like that for Amos. But understand this. It wasn't that Amos was anti-rich people or anti-success. No, the thing that disturbed this farmer, this prophet, was the fact that the judges of Israel were dishonest. The government was corrupt, which allowed and even encouraged the rich to gain their enormous wealth, not by hard work, but by acts of injustice and oppression. Isn't that a picture of our society today? There are governments and people like in governments and judges and people in general who are exactly the same way as what we're looking at in the story of Amos. Corrupt. And this allowed the rich to gain enormous wealth. The dishonest merchants and judges conspired to make the lives of the poor even more miserable, beyond endurance. Have you ever met people like that in the world today? People who get to a point where they're at breaking point and they've reached that end of their endurance because they're struggling to get by in life. We hear today on the news and on the radio and television about people who are struggling to deal with life, even to afford food in the homes that they live in today. It was a bit like that for the poor in the time of Amos. What did the judges get up to make it so miserable? They sold men into slavery. And if they couldn't pay their debts, even for some small amount, even for such as the cost of a pair of sandals, that's the kind of people that Amos was trying to get the message across to. What a life. What a life it must have been for the people in that day. And for Amos to see it. The wealthy took their debtors' garments as pledges, but they didn't return them at sundown as God had demanded in Exodus. Instead, each evening, these rich sinners visited pagan altars where they got drunk on wine, purchased with the fines they extracted from the poor. What an existence. What a life. There in their drunken stupor, they slept by the pagan altars, using their debtors' clothing as a bed defiling the garments and disobeying God's law. In short, the officials were getting rich by exploiting the people. Again, isn't that a picture of society today? There are people being exploited left, right, and center. And they were using in this story their unjust gain in the committing of sinful acts. Again, that's a picture of society today. The women of the land were just as heartless and made such demands on their husbands. Are you listening, guys? They in turn heaped new burdens upon the poor people of the day. So it wasn't a proud time in which to live in. God's chosen nation was heading for a downfall. Amos was trying to tell the people that God is a God of justice. He's just. He's impartial. And he must judge iniquity. God is a God of justice. But he takes note of what's going on in the nations of this world. God's looking down on us today, and I wonder what he thinks about you and about me. Because I think this is an awesome message that needs to be preached to the countries across the world and the kingdoms of our world that we live in. Because this God of justice holds nations accountable. He's not going to turn a blind eye to what's going on. Whether you're a king, a president, prime minister, politician, or even you and me. And the worst thing that Amos saw as God's prophet was the fact that the people were outwardly religious. I bet in the day church attendance was up. But Amos had a job to do. People were very godly in their claims to be the special people of God. And I suppose people look at me and look at you and think, oh, they're special because they know God. And there were people who lived in the time of Amos who would have thought exactly that. They were special because they were a child of God. But they weren't acting like that. And Amos saw that their brand of religion obviously did not make for better moral behavior. In other words, back then, everyone was singing about heaven, but some of them weren't going to go there. And it's like that today in society. Even in churches, there will be people who sing about heaven and hear about heaven on a weekly basis. Some of them aren't going to go there. That's just a fact. Some of them aren't going to go there. So the people were very godly in their claims to be special. But God, Amos saw that their religion wasn't going to get them anywhere. Amos was wise enough to know that worship is nothing but empty ritual unless it leads to changed lives. And Amos wasn't saying that. And I think sometimes we look at people in our churches, yeah, we're supposed to have changed lives, but we look and think, well, they haven't really changed a great deal. They're doing what they've always wanted to do, and yet God wants to do so much more with their lives. It was like that in the time of Amos. So I think that's something that we need to look at and listen to today, because this message speaks to all of us as it did to Amos back in the day. And then you're wondering, how did Israel sink so low? How did things get so bad for God's chosen people? And sometimes that can happen to you and me in our walk with God. Things happen to you and me, and how we deal with it will determine whether we sink so low and we break, and we get to breaking point, and we're looking for answers to the issues that we are struggling with. In the same way, in the story of Amos, you see, the people had lost sight of their need for God. And I think that can happen to you and me in the same way it did in the time of Amos. We can lose sight of our need for God, because in this story, they forgot all that God had done for them in freeing them from bondage. I wonder if sometimes we get complacent and we feel like that. We forget what God has brought us through, and where he's brought us to. So easy to do that because this world will try and drag you down. And it was the same in the time of Amos. People were being dragged down. People became self-sufficient and materialistically worldly. Some began to practice the idol worship that was so prevalent in the world back then. And it's a bit like that today. Amos even saw father and son using the same pagan temple prostitute. Now, Amos was basically a preaching prophet. That's what he was. The book that bears his name in the Old Testament is a collection of his sermons. I've heard it said that preachers are called by God to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And after reading Amos's sermon, I would say that he tended to major on the latter. He preached his first afflict the comfortable sermon at the temple in Bethel. Amos was there to sell his crops, and he felt led to go to church. When he arrived, he stood on the steps. I could just picture him standing on those steps near the altar, and he began to deliver his message to the people of the day. Amos may have been an uneducated farmer, but he obviously knew one of the most important tactics for delivering a successful sermon is you must have a great introduction. And he had a great introduction because listen to what he did. He structured his sermon that day so that his first words caught the people's attention. You've got to do that, haven't you? You've got to catch the people's attention for them to be able to listen and do something about what they're hearing. Amos was like that. And it made them want to hear more. He did this by beginning his message with a detailed list of the sins of the nations all around Israel. He preached against the evils of the people of Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Ammon, and Moab. And I can imagine the people loved to hear him do that because they weren't affected by it. He was talking about other people. And isn't that a bit like us today? We like to listen to what other people are getting up to, but about ourselves, oh no, I'll keep that quiet if you don't mind. Thank you very much. And it was a bit like that. That's why he had to do something about it, because he knew it was part of their sinful nature to take delight in doing what they were doing. And sometimes we take delight, don't we, in hearing what other people are up to, good, bad, indifferent, whatever. We just like to hear stories, don't we? Even in churches. We like to hear about what sort of sins people have been up to and where they've come from and where they're at now. You see, Amos had the congregation in the palm of his hand back then. And that's a great feeling, I think, for a preacher, to know that people are actually listening. Problem is that all they're doing, listening. They're not doing anything about it. I was hoping to experience that feeling myself now. But I don't know, you see, because I don't know really where you're at right now. Well, I know God does. And I think now and then, Amos' sermon introduction, when he finished, people would be angry. People would be frustrated. People would be absolutely gobsmacked that he was talking about them. Because when he went down to further preach, he began to list the sins of Judah and Israel. And when he did that, I'm sure many who were present grew angry and felt that he quit preaching and gone to meddling. You ever been like that when you've asked people, how are you getting on in life? And they talk about stuff. We talked this morning about when we were outside there, about sometimes when I get on a bus or when you get on a journey somewhere, people just talk. And they'll talk about all sorts of different things. They wouldn't dare tell their mom, their dad, their brother, their sister, or whoever. But they talk about that to you on the bus. Well, Amos was a bit like that. He wasn't meddling. He just wanted them to get their lives right with God. So what Amos did that day in Bethel was the same as if a farmer walked into the Strong Point Centre this morning and preached exactly the same way that Amos did, because he wanted to get their attention. And he preached against the sins associated with their lives at the time. I mean, this message really got the people mad. He definitely afflicted the comfortable, because everybody at the time were comfortable. Most of the people who were poor were looking for answers to why they were struggling to get through life. And I'll tell you something, when they heard this story from Amos, when he was preaching this, there would be no amens going on, because people felt guilty. Their response was, throw him out. Get rid of him. Get him out of here. That's what happened to Amos. They threw him out. He went home and he wrote his messages down, which, as I said, is what we have in this little book of the Old Testament. And I'm sure you will agree with me that people should have listened to the message God gave Amos that day. Again, it's a bit like society today. Goes in there and out there. People aren't interested, but that's the world we live in today. In similar ways, the world that Amos had to live in. It went in one ear and out the other. I think we should always listen and heed the word of God. It's there for a reason. It's there to help us to grow in Him. Amos understood that. But since they didn't listen, the inevitable happened. They suffered the natural consequences of disobeying God's law. By the way, we must understand this. Not so much that we break the laws of God, as it is that we are broken by them. I mean, there's always heartbreaking pain and suffering associated with sin. That's a fact of life. Because sin always catches up with you. And there'll be heartache and heartbreak there along the way. In chapter 6 of this book, Amos used an interesting word picture of his sermons. This farmer turned prophet, turned preacher, asks, does one plough the sea with oxen? And he said that, which might have seemed strange to you now, but at the time, he said this to make the people imagine what would happen if a farmer tried this. He and his oxen would, of course, sink to the bottom. I wonder where you're at this morning. Are you a bit like that? Has your life sunk so low that you don't know how to get it back to where it was? Well, you can't get it back to where it was, because in the same way, when Amos was preaching, people had the opportunity to turn to Christ. Amos was saying it's just as inevitable for us to suffer if we defy the law of God. And we live in a society today where people defy the law of God. We hurt ourselves when we sin, which is why God spends so much time in His book telling us not to do it. Now, I don't know about you, but as I study the experience of Amos, I see many parallels between our own culture and that of the people of Amos's day. So as we begin a new week, I think it's very important for us to pay close attention to his sermon, even if it makes you feel a bit uncomfortable. I mean, let's be honest, even as Christians, you and I are active participants of one of the most materialistic cultures in the history of the human race. Why? Because we're normal people. That's what we do. We fall into the same trap as the people did in the time of Amos. In fact, I think our problem stems from the fact that just like the Israelites, you and I are in danger of forgetting a very important spiritual principle. And that's the importance of pursuing holiness. It's a tough one to ask, isn't it? Pursuing holiness. Holiness is a very scriptural idea. In fact, the word holy in various forms occurs more than 600 times in the Bible. Two of these times are found in Leviticus 11:44, when God says, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy. You see, to be holy is to be morally blameless. For only God is morally blameless. Only God is holy. But this text from Leviticus comes in hundreds of others like it, or in there in Scripture for you and I. We've got to strive for it. We've got to pursue it, because holiness needs to be in our daily living. I think a good definition of holiness is this: willfully separating ourselves from sin and separating ourselves to God. Willfully separating ourselves from sin and separating ourselves to God. Why do you think so many Christians struggle with the pursuit of holiness? First of all, I think it's our attitude towards sin. It's become more self-centered than God-centered. That's the world we live in. That's the people out there. It could be the people in here. We get to a point where we're more self-centered than God-centered. Paul said in Galatians 2:20, when he talked about living by faith, many times we think that no effort at holy living is required on our part. We think that all is needed is faith in God and everything will be all right. It doesn't work like that. We must face the fact that we have a personal responsibility to walk in holiness. We're called to use the freedom of choice that God's given you and given me, and decide to obey Him and live holy like lives. God's given us, and decide to obey Him and live this holy life. That's tough. Pursuing holiness involves striving to live out our faith each and every day. What's the struggle? Each and every day. To get up out of bed in the morning and just behave the way God expects you to behave, and act the way God expects you to act. This verse, I think, should remind us that if we don't strive to be like God, the world will pull us the other way. Because pursuing holiness involves pulling against the sinful world that we live in, pulling against the influences that are around us on a daily basis. And it's a tough one. It's like pulling a huge rubber band, because if you stop pulling into one direction, you'll be pulled back in the other. That's what happens to you and me in life. The other problem we have with holy living is that we don't take sin seriously. The world doesn't take sin seriously today, just as it did back then in the time of Amos. The danger with this way of thinking is that it's the little sins that always lead to the bigger sins. Amos and anyone who God has used in furthering His kingdom will tell you it's essential to pull away from the world on a regular basis. I know sometimes we fail in that area, but we come back. And God welcomes us back. I need to tell you that this morning. Sometimes we need to experience solitude each and every day so that we can spend some uninterrupted time away from the world, but spend some positive time with God. We need to do that as individuals and as a church. I'm going to ask the band if they'll come up now. Bev Shear used to sing these words: I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by His nail-pierced hands. I'd rather have Jesus than houses or lands. I'd rather be led by His nail-pierced hands than to be the king of a vast domain and be held in sin's dread sway. I'd rather have Jesus than anything this world affords today. What about you? I ask myself the same question. What about me? As you look back on 2024, would you say, well, I've been pursuing holiness? Or would you say, well, I've been living for the things of this world? Well, I need to tell you this as well. If you look back and see that you're headed down a dead-end street, you're going nowhere, I want to tell you this. God allows you to take a U-turn. You can take a U-turn this morning and have your life changed. So in this year, you can turn away from the way of living. You can return to God. I'm glad about that this morning. We can return to God because He accepts us the way we are. Even old afflict the comfortable. Amos ended his sermon with a word of hope. We need to have a word of hope, don't we, in this world today? In chapter 9, he quoted God as saying, I will restore David's fallen tent. I will repair its broken places, restore its ruins, and build it as it used to be. So if your life needs repairing due to the damage our sinful world inflicts upon you and me, then bring it to Jesus, because He will repair all those broken places. So that's the message this morning that Amos has for all of us. And in that message, there is hope.